It was February 26, 1988, and the United Center did not yet exist. What existed was the Chicago Stadium, which the players called the Madhouse on Madison, a name that undersold it. The building sat on West Madison Street on the near west side of the city, and on a February night in Chicago, the cold came off Lake Michigan in sheets that felt intentional, like the city itself was trying to discourage visitors. The temperature outside was 11 degrees Fahrenheit. Inside, the stadium held 17,450 fans who had been packed into a structure built in 1929, a building with so little modern ventilation that the collective body heat of the crowd raised the arena temperature to somewhere near 80 degrees, creating a greenhouse effect that made the air shimmer above the court by the fourth quarter. The parquet floor, recently refinished, caught the overhead light and gave it back in long amber streaks. The game had been sold out for 11 days. There were people standing in the upper concourse who had paid scalpers for the right to peer between the shoulders of strangers at a maple rectangle 194 feet long. The public address system hummed with a low frequency that you felt in your sternum before you heard it in your ears, and when the crowd responded to a play, the noise inside that building reached decibel levels that visiting players compared to standing next to a jet engine. Road teams lost in that building not because they lacked talent. They lost because the building itself was a weapon, and the man who played home games there had learned to use it like one. The Chicago Bulls were not yet champions. That word, champions, was still theoretical in the winter of 1988, still a projection, still a thing that columnists qualified with terms like eventually and if he ever gets the supporting cast. Michael Jordan was 24 years old. He had been in the league 3 years, and those 3 years had produced numbers that statisticians kept double-checking because they looked like transcription errors. He had led the league in scoring the previous season with 37.1 points per game. He had won the slam dunk contest twice. He had been named to 5 all-star teams, which was already impossible mathematics given the timeline. And yet, that February, the conversation in basketball was not entirely about Jordan. It was also, insistently, about Hakeem Olajuwon, the 7-foot center from Lagos, Nigeria, who played for the Houston Rockets and who had spent the first half of the 1987 to 1988 season doing something that no one in the league could stop. The Rockets had come to Chicago riding a 5-game winning streak, and Olajuwon had come in particular carrying numbers and a specific public disposition that had been building since the summer. He had given an interview to a Houston newspaper in January in which he said, with the measured precision of someone who has thought the sentence through, that he did not believe any guard in the league could score consistently against a disciplined, attentive 7-foot defender positioned and waiting at the rim. He did not say Jordan's name. He did not need to. Everyone who read the quote understood the address. Hakeem Olajuwon in February 1988 was the most complete center in the world, and that was not a debatable position. He stood 7 feet tall and weighed 255 pounds, and unlike most men of those dimensions, he moved with a fluidity that made you briefly question the physics of large bodies. He had been a professional soccer goalkeeper in Nigeria before basketball found him, and that background had given him lateral movement, reflexive timing, and a spatial awareness of angles and trajectories that most 7-footers never developed because they had never needed to. He could go left or right with equal effectiveness. He had what coaches called the dream shake, a pivot and counter move so precisely calibrated to the human body's response time that even players who had studied film of it for days found themselves off balance the moment he initiated it. He had led the league in blocks the previous 2 seasons, and would do so again. His block numbers for the 1987 to 1988 season going into that February game were 3.7 per game, 3.7 per game. To put that in the language of what it meant in practice, it meant that in every game Olajuwon played, 3 or 4 offensive players attempted what they believed was a good shot near the basket and discovered, in the half-second after they released it, that they had been wrong. He had become the primary argument for a specific theory of basketball defense, which held that a truly elite rim protector could neutralize any offensive player in the league, because eventually every player who wanted to win would have to come inside, and inside, Olajuwon would be waiting. His teammates believed this. The Houston coaching staff had built their scheme around it. And Olajuwon himself, in the quiet confidence of a man who had empirical evidence for his self-assessment, believed it too. When asked before the game how he intended to defend Jordan, he said what he had been saying for weeks in different formulations and with increasing specificity. He said Jordan was welcome to every jump shot from 20 feet. And then he said, with the composure of a man describing a fact rather than a prediction, that any time Jordan came toward the basket, he would find 7 feet of problem waiting for him. The Houston Chronicle had run a small boxed feature that morning under the headline, Dream vs. Air, Who Owns the Paint? It was the kind of sports page packaging that required no great journalistic insight, just the recognition of a narrative that had already announced itself. The item included Olajuwon's block statistics, Jordan's scoring average, and a 3-sentence paragraph, noting that Jordan had been blocked 4 times in a game against the Rockets earlier that season, a number that the paper presented without further comment, letting the arithmetic do its editorial work. 4 times in one game. It was the kind of detail that gets repeated in locker rooms, that travels from city to city in the suitcases of professional athletes who collect every piece of evidence that confirms their theory about the world and about themselves. And Olajuwon's theory, supported by that statistic, and by 3.7 blocks per game, and by his own vast, legitimate talent, was that the basket was his, that the paint was a territory he administered, and that even Michael Jordan would have to pay a toll to enter it that he might not always be willing to pay. That was the theory. The Chicago Stadium was where the theory would be tested. Jordan had read the Chronicle piece. One of the equipment staff had clipped it and left it in the usual spot, folded once, on the small shelf above Jordan's locker. Jordan had a system with such items. He read them once, quickly, without visible reaction, then set them aside. He did not throw them away. There was a shoebox in the back of his locker, a plain brown box, no label, that had been there since early in the season. What went into the box was never discussed. What it represented was understood by anyone who had spent enough time watching him. It was not a scrapbook. It was more like what a chemist might call a precursor, the raw material required for a reaction that would produce something at a temperature far beyond what most people could tolerate. Jordan taped his wrists before every game in a ritual so consistent it had become invisible to his teammates, each wrap precise, the tension even, the angle of the tape over the joint identical from one night to the next. He did it slowly, without looking, because his hands knew the process without instruction. And on that February night, one of the ball boys, a 16-year-old who had worked home games for 2 seasons, would later tell a friend that what he noticed was not the taping itself, but what happened to Jordan's face while he was doing it. The expression closed, the boy said, trying to find the right language for something he had felt more than observed. Like a door you can see but cannot open. Like whatever was on the other side of that face had already decided something and was simply waiting for the game to begin. The first quarter did not look like the beginning of anything historic. Jordan scored 11 points, respectable, unsurprising, distributed across jump shots from the elbow and 2 drives that he converted at the rim, though not explosively, not with the complete finality that he was capable of. Olajuwon was positioned correctly every time Jordan came toward the basket, and while Jordan made the plays he attempted only the ones whose geometry made him confident. He was reading the defense the way a chess player reads the board in the opening, not to win immediately but to map the available space and to note where the resistance was strongest. Olajuwon moved well. He communicated with his guards, called out positions, slid his feet into the passing lanes, with the authority of someone who had practiced these movements so many thousands of times that the decision-making had dropped below consciousness into the body itself. The Rockets were up 4 at the end of the first. Olajuwon had 3 points and 1 block. Jordan had the 11. The game was, by any surface reading, proceeding normally. It was in the second quarter that something began to shift, though shift is too dramatic a word for what it actually was. What it actually was is harder to describe, because it looked like nothing in particular from the seats, and even from the press row it registered only as a pattern you recognized only in retrospect. Jordan began going to places on the floor that Olajuwon could not easily cover without leaving other things vulnerable. He set screens for his teammates and then received the ball back on the roll in positions that were not quite at the rim and not quite on the perimeter, but in a middle zone, a no-man's land for a 7-footer whose greatest effectiveness came from being planted close to the basket. 3 times in that quarter, Jordan got the ball in the mid-range, in that dead zone between 15 and 18 feet. And 3 times he made the shot with the mechanical regularity of someone demonstrating a skill to a student. Not showing off, just showing. Olajuwon could come out and contest those shots, but doing so meant leaving the paint, which meant leaving it available for Jordan's teammates. Or he could stay back and give Jordan the mid-range look, which Jordan was converting at a rate that, in retrospect, made the choice between the 2 options feel like the choice between 2 unfavorable weather events. Jordan added 9 in the second quarter. The Bulls closed the gap. At halftime, Chicago trailed by 1, and the press row was beginning to write the first draft of what they believed they were watching, which was a competitive game between 2 elite players, an interesting storyline about Jordan versus Olajuwon, a story whose resolution was genuinely uncertain. They were right about the uncertainty. They were wrong about where the story was. The story was inside Hakeem Olajuwon's head, and it had been there since the second quarter, though Olajuwon would not have acknowledged it even to himself at that point. What was happening was not panic, because Olajuwon was not a man who panicked. He was a man who categorized and responded, and what he was in the process of categorizing was an anomaly in his understanding of how this game was supposed to go. Jordan was not coming at him directly. Jordan was not testing the rim protection theory in the way that Olajuwon had anticipated, which was with the direct, full-speed drives that Jordan was famous for, the ones where you either blocked the shot or you didn't, and the contact was decisive and clear. Instead, Jordan was doing something more disorienting, which was playing a game in which the direct confrontation was perpetually available and perpetually deferred, dangled like a question, whose answer Jordan had not yet decided to provide. It was like arguing with someone who agrees with everything you say and still somehow ends up further ahead than when the argument started. Olajuwon's defensive statistics at halftime were precise: 0 blocks, 2 fouls, and a creeping intuition that he was being positioned rather than challenged, that he was a piece being moved on a board whose dimensions he had not yet fully perceived. He sat in the locker room and said nothing about this because there was nothing to say. There was only the second half which he trusted. His trust was in his body, in his training, in the evidence of 3 seasons of professional basketball in which his theory had been confirmed night after night against the best players in the world. He was not wrong to trust it. The only variable he had not adequately accounted for was Jordan. The third quarter began and Jordan scored on the first possession. A pull-up jumper from 17 feet that Olajuwon had moved to contest and arrived at 4 inches too late. The ball already through the net by the time Olajuwon's hand reached the space where it had been. The crowd in the stadium went up, not explosively, but in the sustained building way that announced a game condition rather than a moment. Jordan was 24 points now, and he had not yet done what everyone in the building understood was eventually coming. He had not yet come directly at Hakeem Olajuwon at full speed with the specific intention of winning the confrontation that the Chronicle piece had framed and that Olajuwon had publicly accepted. And in the delayed arrival of that confrontation, the tension in the building had been accumulating like pressure behind a door. Every possession where Jordan elected for the mid-range instead of the drive was another increment of pressure. Every contested jumper that fell clean was another piece of evidence deposited in a case that was building toward a conclusion. The Rockets were still in the game, down 3 with 8 minutes left in the third. Olajuwon had answered with 8 points of his own in the quarter. Beautiful low-post work, fluid and precise. The dream shake materializing twice against Chicago's big men for easy scores. He was still the best center in the world. The game was still alive. And then, with 7 minutes and 42 seconds left in the third quarter, with the Bulls holding the ball at half court after a Rockets miss, Jordan caught the ball at the top of the key. The description of what happened next requires a kind of slow motion that real time does not provide. So what follows is not quite the event as it occurred, but the event as it reveals itself when you stop it, back it up, and play it again in the frame-by-frame examination that later analysis would afford. Jordan caught the ball with Olajuwon positioned at the free throw line extended, positioned correctly for the space Jordan had been occupying, playing the mid-range, defending the shot he had been getting. Jordan caught it and did not rise for the jumper. He held the ball, both hands, at chest height, and looked at Olajuwon, and the specific quality of that look was something that Jordan's teammates and the players who had faced him across years of competition described consistently, in different words that meant the same thing. It was not aggression. It was not excitement. It was the specific attentiveness of a man who has arrived at the moment he has been directing everything toward, and who finds, now that he is here, that he is calm, completely calm. Calmer than anyone watching from the outside could account for, given the pressure of the moment, the crowd, the narrative weight of the evening. Jordan took one dribble to his left. Olajuwon read it and moved left. Jordan crossed over right, and the cross was clean, almost too clean. The kind of ball handling that looks casual until you understand that casual at this level of competition is a form of art. The concealment of effort so complete that the effort disappears. Olajuwon recovered, and he recovered well, because he was exceptional. But recovering well was not the same as recovering in time, and those two things were separated by something that was not measurable in the ordinary units of space and distance. What separated them was Jordan's specific understanding of where that body of 7 feet would be in the next 0.2 of a second, an understanding built from 3 years of playing this game against every configuration of size and talent the league could arrange, and the gap between where Olajuwon was and where Jordan was going was exactly the gap that Jordan had calculated, not in the moment, not consciously, but in the accumulated, embodied arithmetic of 10,000 hours of work that had made calculation indistinguishable from instinct. Jordan was going to the rim. He was inside now. He was inside, and Olajuwon had rotated, was rotating, was in the process of arriving, and what Olajuwon had promised, what the Houston Chronicle had framed, what the January interview had stated as a proposition about the nature of the paint and who administered it, was about to be answered. Jordan left the floor 4 feet from the basket. Not 2 feet, not at the rim, but 4 feet out. And he left the floor moving forward, still moving forward, his body horizontal to the floor in the extension of the leap, and Olajuwon went up too because there was nothing else to do. Olajuwon's right hand rising in the arc of a block attempt that had ended hundreds of such plays for 3 seasons, that had embarrassed guards and forwards and even other centers who had believed they had the angle, who had believed they had the opening. Olajuwon's hand was there. It was in the correct position. It was in the position that the physics of the play should have required Jordan to contend with. And Jordan did not shoot. Jordan held the ball while he was in the air, while Olajuwon's hand was at its apex, while the crowd was already making the sound that anticipated a block or a contested layup. And Jordan waited, extended horizontally 4 feet from the basket, in a posture that should have been impossible for a human body that was also under the gravitational obligation to fall. And he waited until Olajuwon had begun to fall, until the apex of the block attempt had passed, until the hand was descending. And then, from that position, from that extended horizontal falling position that no coaching manual had ever prescribed because it was not teachable, Jordan banked the ball softly off the glass and through the net. The contact between ball and glass was barely audible. The contact between ball and net was the clean whisper of a made basket. Olajuwon's hand came down through empty air, and the Chicago Stadium, all 17,450 people, released the pressure that had been building since the second quarter, in a sound that one sports writer in attendance would describe in his notebook simply as, "The building exploded." Hakeem Olajuwon landed. He landed and stood and looked at the basket, and what was visible on his face in that moment was not available to the cameras positioned at press row, because his back was to most of them. But the players who were on the floor near him, the Rockets players, the Bulls players who had rotated over and were now jogging back on transition, saw what happened to his face. It was not anger. It was something more complicated than anger, and more interesting. It was the expression of a man in the process of revising a document he had believed was finished. The theory that had seemed airtight, the proposition about the paint and the rim protection and the inevitability of the 7-footer in his domain, that proposition had just been violated, not by a stronger opponent, or a better block, or even a conventional countermove. It had been violated by something that should not have been physically possible, that had no precursor in the film Olajuwon had watched, no analog in the documented behavior of guards coming toward him. Jordan had not beaten the block. Jordan had absorbed the block into his plan, had accounted for it, had used Olajuwon's own timing against him, had turned the very presence of 7 feet of shot-blocking excellence into the lever by which the play was made. This was not a basketball move. It was a statement delivered in the language of basketball, and the statement was, "I have already thought of everything you will do." He stood at the free throw line for a moment, just a moment, and the timeout that the Rockets called immediately after was not a tactical timeout. It was a timeout called because the Rockets' coach, Bill Fitch, had watched his best players face from the bench and understood that the game, whatever the scoreboard said, had already been decided in a place the scoreboard did not measure. Jordan made the free throw. He had been fouled on the play, Olajuwon's descending hand having grazed his forearm in the fraction of a second between the apex of the block and the release, and Jordan made the free throw with the unhurried attention of someone completing a task rather than seizing an opportunity. He bounced the ball 3 times before each free throw. He always bounced it 3 times. The routine was identical whether he was up 20 or down 2. He made both. He made both, and he turned back toward half court, and there was nothing theatrical in how he moved. No pointing, no stare held for the audience, no extended moment of acknowledgement. He was already thinking about the next possession. This was the part of Jordan that observers described with admiration and something adjacent to unease. The part where the victory and the next challenge were separated by no gap at all, where the completion of one competitive objective registered only as the precondition for the next one, where the ordinary human need to pause and feel the pleasure of having won was simply absent, replaced by a forward momentum that had no natural stopping point. His teammates understood this. They had felt, at various moments, the particular isolation of playing alongside someone for whom the emotional experience of winning existed only as fuel rather than as reward, who burned the victory to reach the next thing without ever stopping to warm himself at the fire. In the Houston locker room after the game, which the Bulls won 114-102, with Jordan finishing with 41 points, Olajuwon dressed slowly. He answered the reporters' questions with the careful language of a man who had been publicly generous with words before the game, and who understood now the specific risk of public generosity when you are in a business where other people are paid to prove you wrong. He said Jordan was exceptional. He said the play was extraordinary. He said, and here his voice carried the particular inflection of a man speaking a sentence that he would spend years contextualizing but never fully escaping, that he had not seen that before. He had not seen it before. The most decorated shot blocker of his generation, a man who had developed his entire understanding of offensive players around the principle that at some point, at the rim, the laws of basketball reasserted themselves, and size and position and timing prevailed, said he had not seen that before. Not from a guard, not from any player, not at that speed, at that angle, with that degree of conscious manipulation of his own block attempt built into the execution of the play. He said it to the reporters because the reporters were there and the question had been asked, and then he said nothing more on the subject, because there was nothing more to say that would not simply be a variation of the same sentence, a sentence that admitted something about the categories he had trusted, about the theory that had seemed airtight, about the nature of waiting at the rim for someone who had already decided you were part of the plan. The shoebox in Jordan's locker received nothing new that night. The Chronicle piece had been folded once and placed there 3 days before the game. Whatever it had contributed had already been converted, had already been metabolized and expressed through 41 points and one particular play that lasted 5 seconds and ended an argument. Jordan left the stadium that night through the same side exit he always used, past the same security guard, into the same February cold that had been there when he arrived. 11 degrees, the lake wind off Michigan still coming in sheets. He was wearing a Bulls warm-up over his uniform, and he had not showered yet because he sometimes walked to his car before the locker room cleared, needing the cold air and the brief private darkness between the building and the lot. He stood outside for 47 seconds. One of the security staff clocked it once because they had nothing else to do. Jordan stood in 11-degree air with his eyes open and his breath visible and his hands at his sides, and then he walked to his car and drove toward the next thing. Toward wherever he was directing all of it, toward the place where 41 points and the erasure of a theory about rim protection in Chicago was already being converted into the appetite for whatever came next. He did not look back at the building. He never looked back at the buildings. Hakeem Olajuwon would win 2 championships, both of them after Jordan retired the first time. He would win the Finals MVP twice. He would be inducted into the Hall of Fame and named to the 50 greatest players in NBA history, and widely regarded as the greatest center who ever played the game. An argument that has partisans who can make it convincingly. None of that erases what happened in February 1988 in the madhouse on Madison, and none of it was intended to. The measure of Olajuwon's career is not that Jordan found a way past him on one night with a play that violated the physics of expectation. The measure of it is that he rebuilt after that night, that he took what the game gave him as information and continued, that he won his championships with the precision and dignity of a man who understood that the game was longer than any one moment. But there is a night, somewhere in the accumulated memory of his career, that he returns to in the way that professionals return to the specific moments that taught them something they did not want to learn. A night when a 24-year-old guard came into his territory and found a dimension in which the territory did not apply. He does not talk about it often. The story does not need him to. What the story needs, what it has always needed, is the understanding that Jordan did not invent that play on the night of February 26, 1988. He prepared it. He prepared it in the practice facility and in the summer and in the film sessions and in the 10,000 hours of previous confrontation that had deposited in the instrument of his body and the architecture of his mind, the complete map of what a 7-foot shot blocker would do in that situation and the complete answer to what a 7-foot shot blocker would do in that situation. The humiliation of Olajuwon was not a humiliation in any diminishing sense of the word, because Olajuwon was great enough that humbling him required an act of basketball genius, required something that did not exist in the conventional library of the sport, required a new page. Jordan wrote it. He wrote it the way he wrote everything, not in the moment, but in advance, in the years of accumulation that meant, when the moment arrived, he was already done, already finished, already past it, and looking forward, while the rest of the people in the building were still processing what they had just seen. The clock in the stadium read 7 minutes and 42 seconds left in the third quarter when he caught the ball at the top of the key. 5 seconds later, the argument was over. What lives in those 5 seconds is not a basketball play. It is the principle that the most dangerous opponent is not the one who comes at you directly. It is the one who has already mapped every move you will make and has turned your strength into the mechanism of your own defeat. That principle does not belong to sport. It belongs to every arena in which preparation meets pressure and something new is required. It belongs to every person who has ever stood in front of a challenge larger than themselves, been told the obstacle was immovable, and spent the preceding years becoming precisely the kind of force that immovable things have no answer for.